They had heard the rumors long before they saw one. Whispers from the front lines spoke of a beast, an armored monster that defied logic, whose very name sent shivers through Allied tank crews. The Germans called it the Königstiger, the King Tiger. For American tankers, it was something out of a nightmare, an unstoppable fortress of steel that could tear through Shermans like paper. But one day, in the chaos of a collapsing front, that nightmare rolled into their hands, broken, battered, and humiliated. And what they discovered inside stunned them. The spring of 1945 was unlike anything the Americans had faced before. Europe was crumbling, the Reich was dying, and the once mighty German war machine was coughing its final breaths. Yet, even in its death throes, it still had teeth. Reports came in from scattered divisions about these new Tigers, massive tanks that could hold off entire battalions. They weren't just tanks, they were statements of defiance, symbols of Nazi engineering pride. And for the men on the ground, the King Tiger represented both awe and terror. Every time the distant boom of an 88mm gun echoed across the fields, they wondered if that was it, their last few seconds before being reduced to molten metal. In late April, near the German town of Kassel, an American armored battalion advanced cautiously through the countryside. The war was nearly over, but the landscape still hid dangers, pockets of resistance, snipers, mines, and the occasional stray Tiger tank that refused to surrender. The Americans moved carefully, their M4 Shermans rolling forward with infantry support. Then came the radio call. A reconnaissance jeep had spotted something enormous in a nearby village, half buried in the mud, turret askew, with its crew nowhere in sight. A Tiger II. Intact. The order came quickly. Secure the area. Approach with caution. The possibility of booby traps was real, and none of the men wanted to be the last casualty of a dying war. As the platoon neared the hulking machine, the air was thick with anticipation. Even standing still, the Tiger radiated menace. Its sloped armor gleamed under a film of dust, its massive 88mm cannon pointed uselessly toward the horizon. A machine that had terrified thousands now sat motionless, like a fallen giant. "Christ, look at the size of that thing," muttered one of the tankers. "No wonder they call it a king." They circled it slowly, rifles raised. The hatches were open. Inside, the smell of burnt oil and metal hung heavy. The driver's seat was empty, the radio torn out. A few German documents lay scattered on the floor, maintenance notes, ammunition logs, perhaps a diary. No sign of the crew. They had fled or been captured earlier. But as the Americans examined the tank more closely, they began to notice something odd. The armor was pristine. There were no shell impacts, no signs of battle damage. The beast hadn't been destroyed in combat. It had simply stopped moving. Engine trouble. That's what the mechanics said when they began inspecting it. The Tiger II, for all its terrifying power, was a mechanical nightmare. Its immense weight, nearly 70 tons, strained every part of its design. The engine overheated easily, the suspension broke under stress, and fuel consumption was catastrophic. The Americans, used to their simpler but reliable Shermans, couldn't believe it. They laughed in disbelief. "They built the strongest tank in the world," one soldier joked. "And it couldn't even make it to the front." But the laughter carried a trace of respect. They could see the craftsmanship, the thick welded plates, the precision-cut edges, the advanced optics. This was German engineering at its most ambitious. Yet ambition had turned against itself. The Tiger II was overdesigned, overcomplicated, and built for a war Germany could no longer sustain. Its Maybach engine had to drag almost double the weight it was meant for. Add to that the lack of spare parts and poor fuel quality at the end of the war, and you had a machine destined to fail. Still, standing before that massive steel monster, the Americans felt a strange mix of victory and humility. They had outlasted the legend not by building something stronger, but by building something that worked. The Sherman was fast, simple, and reliable. It could cross rivers, climb hills, and keep running where the Tiger would stall. Quantity had beaten quality, logistics had beaten luxury. The King had fallen not in battle, but under its own weight. The discovery attracted attention. Engineers and intelligence officers arrived to study the captured tank. They documented every bolt, every lever, every marking. They wanted to know what made it so formidable. The optics were remarkable, Zeiss lenses with perfect clarity, far superior to the Allied equivalents. The gun was powerful enough to destroy any Allied tank at ranges where the Shermans couldn't even return fire. The armor, up to 7 inches thick in places, was nearly impenetrable. On paper, it was unbeatable. But theory means little when reality runs out of gasoline. Words spread quickly through the American lines. "They got a King Tiger!" Soldiers came to see it like tourists visiting a fallen monument. Some took photos standing next to the massive tracks, dwarfed by its size. Others climbed on top, inspecting the thick turret. There was awe, but also irony. The greatest tank of the war, captured without a shot fired, because its engine had failed. For the men who had lost friends to these beasts, there was poetic justice in that. At headquarters, officers debated what to do with it. Some wanted to ship it back to the States for testing. Others thought it wasn't worth the trouble, it was too heavy, too broken. Eventually, it was moved to a depot for further inspection. Mechanics worked tirelessly to get the engine running again, but the damage was extensive. The bearings were worn out, the transmission cracked, the cooling system leaking. The Tiger II had been a masterpiece in theory, but a disaster in practice, and yet there was something majestic about it. Standing beside the wreck, an American captain quietly remarked, "You have to hand it to them. They built a king! But even kings fall." In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of Europe and the distant echoes of victory, the Americans realized something deeper. The war wasn't just about weapons, it was about endurance, about simplicity winning over perfection. The King Tiger symbolized everything wrong with the German war effort: brilliance without practicality, ambition without restraint. It was a monument to excess. And now it was theirs, a silent trophy of a war almost over. As night fell over the captured village, the massive silhouette of the Tiger loomed against the darkening sky. The men set up camp nearby, their fires reflecting off the tank's armor. Some joked that it might come alive in the night. Others just stared at it, lost in thought. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the war still had a few cruel days left. But here, in the quiet, the mightiest tank in the world lay still, defeated not by enemy fire, but by the weight of its own creation. By dawn, the fields were silent again. The King Tiger remained where it had died, half sunk in mud, its empty eyes staring toward a front it would never reach. The Americans packed up and moved on, leaving behind the ghost of German engineering, a reminder that even the strongest steel can break when the dream behind it collapses. In the following days, the captured King Tiger became a magnet for curiosity. Officers, engineers, and even journalists came to see the machine that had terrified Allied tankers for nearly a year. It sat like a stranded beast in the field near Kassel, a symbol of Germany's failed dream of invincibility. Every visitor was struck first by its sheer scale, 70 tons of cold precision, its massive guns stretching almost the length of a Sherman tank. Yet, under the imposing armor, it was just another machine, and one that had betrayed its makers at the worst possible time. The American mechanics who examined it couldn't help but marvel. "You can tell," one of them said, wiping grease from his hands. "These guys built it like a Swiss watch. But it's a tank, not a watch." That was the essence of the Tiger II's tragedy. Every component was engineered to perfection, but together they formed a system too delicate for war. It was the result of a philosophy that believed complexity meant superiority, and in the mud, rain, and chaos of battle, that philosophy didn't survive. When the Americans finally managed to open up the engine compartment, what they found confirmed their suspicions. The massive Maybach HL230 P30 engine, a 700 horsepower monster, was burnt out. The oil lines had cracked, the cooling system had failed, and the pistons were scored with damage. The King Tiger had likely overheated while trying to move up a hill. Without spare parts or proper maintenance, the crew must have abandoned it, knowing it couldn't be saved. They had done everything right, but the tank had done everything wrong. Still, the power behind the design couldn't be ignored. The gun, an 88mm KWK-43, was capable of destroying any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. That kind of range was unthinkable to Sherman crews, who had to close the distance dangerously just to have a chance. Many tankers recalled that sickening feeling, seeing a Tiger before they could even reach effective range. The Germans would fire once, and a Sherman would erupt in flames. Against that, the Americans had learned to use numbers, speed, and coordination. A single Tiger might destroy 3 Shermans, but 10 Shermans could outmaneuver it, flank it, and finish it off. War wasn't fair, and it wasn't elegant. It was about who kept moving when the other side broke down. As the engineers tested systems and documented findings, they began to piece together the truth. Germany had built less than 500 King Tigers in total, a drop in the ocean compared to the tens of thousands of Allied tanks. Every one of them was expensive, hard to build, and even harder to maintain. Many never reached combat. Some broke down on transport trains, others ran out of fuel before firing a single shot. This particular Tiger had suffered the same fate. The Reich had poured its last resources into a weapon too heavy to fight and too costly to save. The Americans decided to tow it back to a maintenance depot. That task alone took nearly a full day. Even powerful Sherman recovery vehicles struggled with the weight. The roads, scarred by shellfire and rain, made movement a nightmare. At every bend, the tank's tracks tore up the ground. Soldiers joked that it took an army just to move one Tiger. When it finally arrived at the depot, covered in mud and branches, it looked more like a dead animal being dragged home by its hunters than a prize of war. There, under the supervision of ordnance officers, the full teardown began. Every plate, every screw, every inch of wiring was studied. The results were astonishing. The armor was so thick that American cutting torches struggled to slice through it. The turret ring, the mechanism that allowed the gun to rotate, was an engineering marvel. The optics were pristine, even after weeks of abandonment. The radio systems were compact and efficient. And yet, for all its perfection, the Tiger II was a coffin. Its internal layout left almost no room for the crew to move. The immense heat, noise, and constant vibration would have made combat inside unbearable. Reports from captured German tankers later confirmed what the Americans suspected. The King Tiger was hated as much as it was admired. Crews loved its firepower but despised its unreliability. The slightest mechanical issue could turn it into a 70-ton target. In mud or snow, it could bog down for days. In tight streets, its size made maneuvering impossible. It guzzled fuel like a ship at sea, needing hundreds of gallons for even short movements. And with Allied air superiority, fuel convoys rarely made it far. The Germans had built a lion, but they could no longer feed it. Among the Americans studying the tank was a young lieutenant from the Ordnance Corps, fascinated by machinery. He spent hours sketching diagrams, noting weaknesses and strengths. "It's a masterpiece of the wrong kind," he said. "Too smart for its own good." Those notes would later find their way into post-war reports, influencing early designs of the next generation of American tanks. Lessons in what not to do. The King Tiger had shown the world that raw power wasn't enough. Mobility, reliability, and efficiency were the true kings of the battlefield. As the days passed, the novelty faded, and the soldiers moved on. The Tiger was stripped of useful components and eventually left behind. But the story of its capture spread like wildfire. To the men who had faced Tigers in combat, the idea that one had surrendered to its own mechanical failure was poetic justice. "Guess the king couldn't handle the mud," one veteran quipped. Others were more reflective. They had seen what German industry could create, weapons that seemed almost superhuman. Yet now, standing in the ruins of Germany, they realized the truth. Technology couldn't save a regime that had lost its soul. That sentiment echoed through the final weeks of the war. As the Americans pushed deeper into Germany, they found more abandoned Tigers, some out of fuel, some broken beyond repair, others simply deserted by crews who knew the end was near. Each one told the same story: machines that had outlived their empire. The King Tiger wasn't a symbol of dominance anymore. It was a relic of desperation. Still, when the Americans spoke of that first captured Tiger, There was always a hint of wonder in their voices. They had seen what the enemy's best looked like, and it was magnificent, even in defeat. The tank had failed, but it had earned their respect. In the aftermath of war, that respect would shape the future of armored warfare. The Americans didn't copy the Tiger, they learned from its mistakes. And in that sense, the broken beast had fulfilled a final purpose, teaching its captors how to build better. One night, weeks later, as the depot prepared to move equipment out, a small group of soldiers gathered around the King Tiger one last time. Someone climbed up onto the turret and sat beside the long, silent barrel. "Hard to believe this thing scared half of Europe," he said quietly. The others nodded. "Hard to believe it died of a busted engine." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the faint moonlight glinting off its armor. The war was ending, and with it, the legend of the Tiger. The men walked away, leaving the giant to rust. Behind them, the wind whistled through the empty hatches like a ghost sigh, the last breath of a kingdom built on steel, pride, and illusion. Months after the war ended, the legend of the captured King Tiger still echoed among veterans. For many of the American crews who had fought across France and Germany, that broken-down beast had become a kind of symbol, proof that even the most terrifying weapon could fall to something as simple as human endurance and a bit of luck. Yet for the engineers and historians who studied it after the guns went silent, the Tiger too represented something deeper, the thin line between genius and failure in wartime innovation. At an ordnance testing ground in France, American specialists managed to get the engine running, barely. It took weeks of repairs, scavenged parts from other captured tanks, and gallons of precious fuel. When it finally roared to life, the sound was deafening, a low mechanical growl that shook the air. For a few moments, the men watching could imagine what it must have been like for Allied troops to face this monster in battle. Its treads churned the ground like thunder, and its gun towered menacingly over everything around it. But as the engine began to overheat and sputter again, the illusion faded. The machine that had once embodied fear now looked fragile, almost pitiful, a reminder that no weapon, no matter how advanced, could escape the laws of physics. American test drivers reported that the controls were heavy, visibility was terrible, and the turning radius was so wide that maneuvering in tight areas was nearly impossible. They found that if the tank hit a slope or soft ground, the transmission screamed under strain. Within days, the gearbox failed completely. "It's a mechanical miracle," one engineer wrote in his report. "But miracles don't win wars." That report, sent back to the U.S. Ordnance Department, was circulated among design teams. It became a key lesson as America entered the next era of tank development. By the time the Korean War arrived a few years later, American tanks like the M26 Pershing and the M46 Patton reflected those lessons. They were lighter, faster, and built for real-world conditions, not perfection on paper. The ghost of the King Tiger lingered in every design meeting, a silent reminder of what happens when ambition outruns practicality. It was almost poetic. The tank that had broken down before reaching the front still managed to shape the future of armored warfare. Meanwhile, back in Germany, a few surviving Tigers sat abandoned in fields and forests, slowly sinking into the earth. Some were salvaged for scrap metal, others became museum pieces. Decades later, historians and restorers would bring a few of them back to life, running engines that had been silent for half a century. Every time one of those engines rumbled again, crowds gathered, not just to admire the machine, but to feel the echo of a vanished world. For the people who saw it, the King Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a story cast in steel, a story of pride, power, and collapse. The Americans who had first captured that broken Tiger near Kassel rarely spoke of it in grand terms. For them, it wasn't about capturing the King of Tanks. It was just another day in a brutal war, another reminder that the enemy was human, that their machines broke down just like theirs did. But years later, when those same men looked back, they realized how significant that moment had been. In that silent, dead hulk, they had seen the truth of the German war effort, magnificent on the surface, hollow underneath. One of those soldiers, years later, told a war correspondent, "You could tell they put everything they had into that machine. And that's exactly why they lost." They thought a tank could win a war. His words carried a simple truth, one the Allies had proven time and again. Wars aren't won by perfection. They're won by what works, by what lasts, by the thousands of small, steady steps that keep moving forward even when the enemy builds castles in the air. The King Tiger's downfall wasn't just mechanical. It was philosophical. Nazi Germany had built its military on the idea of superiority, superior people, superior weapons, superior power. But that very obsession blinded them. They spent precious resources perfecting a few tanks instead of building thousands of good ones. They designed engines that couldn't handle the weight, and guns that outperformed the tanks that carried them. The Americans, on the other hand, mass-produced simplicity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. When the Tigers stalled, the Shermans kept rolling. When fuel lines failed, the Allied convoys kept flowing. It was the story of the war itself, a contest between illusion and endurance. When historians later examined German production records, the irony was clear. Out of every 4 King Tigers built, 1 never made it to combat. Most that did were abandoned or destroyed not by enemy fire, but by breakdowns, fuel shortages, or logistical collapse. On the battlefield, power means nothing if it can't move. And as the Americans stood over their captured prize, watching the dawn rise over the wreckage, they understood that the true king wasn't the tiger. It was the soldier who could keep his machine running, no matter how rough the road. In later interviews, Allied officers recalled how that capture changed their perspective. When you're fighting, one of them said, you think the enemy's invincible. You think his machines are perfect. But then you see one sitting there, dead in the mud, and you realize they were just like us. Scared, tired, trying to make their gear work. That sense of shared humanity was rare in wartime, but it surfaced in moments like that. The King Tiger, once a symbol of terror, became a strange kind of equalizer, proof that even the strongest armor can't protect against the chaos of reality. By the time the war officially ended, the captured tiger had been photographed, documented, and analyzed from every angle. It was eventually dismantled, its parts sent to research depots. Some of its armor plates were tested against American rounds, others were melted down. A few fragments survived, pieces of the turret, a damaged track link, a gear assembly. They ended up in museums and private collections, relics of a machine that had once embodied both genius and futility. But its story didn't end there. In the decades that followed, documentaries, books, and films would resurrect the legend of the Tiger tanks. They became icons of power, misunderstood, exaggerated, almost mythical. People spoke of them as if they were invincible, forgetting that many had died not in battle but in breakdown. Yet for those who were there, who had stood beside one rusting in the mud, the truth was far more compelling. The King Tiger wasn't invincible. It was fragile, and that fragility made it human, in a strange, mechanical way. The captured tank near Kassel never reached the front, never fired its gun in anger. But its failure told the world more about the fall of Nazi Germany than any victory could. It revealed the limits of arrogance, and the danger of believing that power alone could conquer all. When American soldiers looked at that silent hulk, they weren't just seeing an enemy's weapon. They were seeing the end of an era, the death of a machine that had tried to rule the battlefield and failed. In the end, the King Tiger's story is a paradox. It was one of the most powerful tanks ever built, yet it was defeated by mud, by distance, by its own perfectionism. The Americans who captured it didn't just seize a tank, they captured a lesson that would echo for generations, that the mightiest weapon is worthless if it cannot endure. And as history moved on, the King Tiger remained, rusting quietly in memory, its name still carrying the weight of both terror and tragedy. Even now, when people see a photograph of it, its enormous gun, its proud, angular hull, they feel a flicker of awe. But if you look closer, beneath the myth, you'll see what the American crews saw that day in 1945, a fallen king, defeated not by fire or fury, but by the quiet failure of its own heart.